Good morning. Now, I've got a couple other videos planned, but for this one I wanted to interject because the supposed performance update dropped, and I wanted to jump in and kind of fly around the area I've done all my other performance reviews, which is downtown Chicago and around O'Hare, and just call out what my thoughts are on it. Now, two parts with this update. It also added in the Xbox release, which changed a bunch of other things that I both like and dislike that I wanted to talk about as well. So first, while I'm sitting here on the runway, I was averaging about 35 to 45 FPS just hanging out on the runway, so that was good. The world map that I've called out several times as randomly being super duper laggy and problematic was pushing 100 FPS as I zoomed in, zoomed out. It was wonderful to be in the menus like that. The menus were super snappy. I could navigate around very quickly, whereas previously it was very laggy at the 5K resolution I play the game in. The aircraft selection menu got a little different. Instead of sliding horizontally, it's now vertically, which I don't mind, and they've got some filters for props and other stuff that are a little more accessible. But what I don't like about it is that instead of going into an airplane to configure it, they just give you three variants of some of the airplanes now. So you've got a Cessna, you've got a Cessna with pontoons, and then a Cessna with skis, or a Cub with pontoons and skis, and so on and so forth, which that stuff I didn't really like. I think they could have done that a little better by just reducing the number of airplanes and allowing you to get into it and work on it that way. Now here, I was going to set my altitude for departure, and when I moused over these buttons, I realized that, whoa, this is different. I loved the callouts that told me what it was and how it highlighted what button I was over. Kind of pulls you out of the immersion, but then it kind of helps you see what you're on. When I clicked on it, it gave me a lock option so that I was locked onto that button. If you remember some of my other videos, I've complained that turbulence or movements of the plane can cause the mouse to slip off of the dial you're on, and sometimes that means that you will lose the input that you're providing to it, which I find a little annoying. However, what I liked about this is I was able to quickly scroll right or left and get my heading adjusted, get my altitude adjusted. But what I didn't like was that it was very difficult to fine-tune it. I lost a lot of the finesse, as it were, for those settings, to where it was very difficult to dial it in accurately. I did like that on the call-out screen for that dial, it also tells you what your selection is. So if I'm looking down lower at a different instrument cluster and I maybe can't see my main artificial horizon and stuff, I can gauge where my altitude is because the dial's telling me, even though I may not be able to see that portion of it. So some of those things were well thought out, and I initially thought, okay, this is different, but I like it, I get it. However, later on in the flight, I just found that the finesse for me was too difficult to overcome. And because I was in that configuration scheme, when I was in the cockpit and if I used my controller button to move my player's head around, I found that it was reversed. It put a little target dot in the center of my screen, and then when I moused over any of the controls, it was expecting me to select those controls with my controller instead of my mouse. So I appreciated the work. I liked being able to better understand what the buttons do, but it created a big problem in some of those other areas. So by the time I flew again, I disabled that and went back to the old scheme, and I just found it a lot more accurate and better for playing with a mouse and a keyboard, or even a joystick. I still prefer to fly with my controller, but I prefer the control scheme to be with mouse. It's just better for me. With that said, I think they did a really good job with those controls and everything. I just think that they're a little bit too sensitive out of the gate, and it makes it a little difficult to finesse headings and adjustments like that. But I give them props for doing a good system. One of the other things I noticed was that when I'm flying around the map, previously when you got within about 5 nautical miles of a point of interest or an airport, it would give you the little pin drop on your screen, and you could see then what that airport is and the information for it. You can turn those on and off. I left them on because I find it kind of handy sometimes floating around, seeing what the buildings are, and I don't mind it, especially because you kind of have to fly up to them before the marker pops up, so you still kind of have to find it, and then you get to see what it is. Now, though, I noticed that airport markers were basically visible from 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles away. I could see those pin drops out on the map, and that was really kind of agitating because I don't want to see those when I'm nowhere near those airports. Like here, I'm flying at Lake Michigan, and on the other side of the lake, I can see there's 2 airports out there. That does me no good right now. I can understand in certain flight systems that you may want that, but you'd also likely be flying to waypoints and other stuff to get to those airports, or you'd fly closer. So I wish there was a way that I could say, you know what, beyond a certain distance, I don't want to see them. I hope they could put that in somewhere, because this kind of kills the immersion, and I like having them on so I can see some of the airports as I get close to them, or I can see some of the points of interest. But right now I'm debating if I keep them on, because it just kind of, I don't like looking out and seeing those markers out there in the distance. In the Cirrus here, I also noticed that inside the cockpit, it seems like some of the texture font size got a little smaller. So from the standard cockpit view, or just slightly zoomed in, it was hard to read some of the buttons inside the cockpit, whereas before it was a little easier. Now I can change some of that. I found it in the menus. I just haven't done it yet. I just wanted to call that out, that it seems like some of the buttons got a little, the text on them got a little smaller or harder to read. From what I understand, it's a little easier to do in VR, but now that this has dropped, I definitely plan to start flying again in VR. And with that, I wanted to segue into the actual performance. It'll be kind of hard to see here, but there are a few moments where the game just seems to lock up and stutter, similar to when I was flying into LAX or around LA previously. I just got massive dumps of FPS. There was a few moments I hit 5 FPS. There were a few moments I dipped way, way low. Other moments in this flight with light clouds and everything else on, my performance was really pretty good. I was pushing 45 to 60 FPS on average, with a few 30 FPS dips in certain areas. But on the whole, my performance was almost double what it has been at this low altitude. And that was really awesome. I was very pleased with that effect, and big kudos to that on the performance. But the stability of it is what I'd like to see fixed, because if I stutter down to 0 FPS and I'm in VR, then my headset screens kind of turn off, because there's no longer an image coming to it, where your monitor is just going to keep the previous image on the screen. And that's something that I really want to see fixed. So hopefully that gets sorted out within a couple patches, but I think they did a really good job with the improvements here so far. There's a bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to talk about just yet, but as we fly here towards the city, if you look at the city lights, they look really good very close to me, but very quickly as you start to get out towards the city, those lights get extremely blurry. It's like somebody's got a focus on the camera and it's not set right, whereas I should be seeing out to infinity fairly clearly. Now I know lights are going to bubble out, they're going to blur a little bit, you're not going to see fine points of light and detail, but this just didn't look quite right to me. Especially on top of the fact that Chicago as a city at night looks like garbage, because the building illumination and the street lights, everything just looks dark and dead in this city, and it's not quite how Chicago looks entirely. So 2 more points of contention with it, but again, the performance on the whole was very good, and I found it a lot more easy to fly around and manage the airplane and take care of business in doing so. So I wanted to give them a good thumbs up on that side of things. Even the patch prior to this one, I'd noticed great improvements in performance flying into Montreal and those other areas. I really didn't have any performance problems. I flew into Montreal at about 25 to 30 FPS that whole flight, never having a single issue, whereas prior patches I would dip 18, 20, 19 and have other issues. And I really haven't changed any of my graphical settings since I did the Windows 10 reinstall. So they've been hard at work on those in the background, and I find that really good. Flight controls seemed a little more twitchy. I did have to go re-input my dead zones across the board, but what I also noticed was that the sensitivity didn't seem to be quite so gradual. It seemed to be a little more linear, where it was, again, that harsh diagonal jump on the chart seemed to be a little more impacting. So flying the little Cirrus around, I really kind of felt that in some maneuvers. I did another flight the day after this, just goofing off in the pontoon Cessna, flying in and out of a lake, and I had moments of really great smooth steady descent and approaches and floating all at the right speed, and it was great. And then I just barely moved my thumb on the stick just a little bit, and instead of a nice smooth nose down or pull up, it just jerked for a second. So I don't know if that's some just registration issues on my controller, but I believe it's more just the sensitivity. I looked at the chart for a little bit, the sensitivity graph, and just kind of played with it for a minute, and I saw the same type of performance there. So it might just be that the chart moves too fast and it's registering too much of an input from the controller. Just something to deal with that on the larger airliners. Because they're so sluggish, it doesn't register, but whereas on these smaller aircraft, it just kind of jerks and jumps around. So hoping they get a lot of that sorted out before the Jets pack releases later this year, or whenever that was, for fighter jets and stuff like that, because those high maneuverable and fast moving aircraft are going to be very difficult to control if you don't have that type of setup in them. And I know FSX, if you jumped in the F-18, it flew very well overall. So anyway, that's my overall review. I think they did overall a fantastic job with all the improvements and ideas. Some of them aren't really for me, but I think they did a good job, and there's a lot of good thought put into them, so kudos to that. The overall performance, again, is a great step up, so I'm very pleased with that. I just hope they get some of the micro stutters sorted out, even it up a little bit. I'd rather take a small performance hit from where we are now, since now we have some room to play with it, and just get some more evenness out of it. And if things maintain a high level here, I may bump the graphics back up. But first, I have a couple flights to complete. I was asked to do a flight from Seoul to Tokyo, so I will get that taken care of. And then I want to get back into VR and see if I can actually get back into playing that, because as you know from my last VR videos, it was just unplayable. So I'm going to leave the rest of the flight up. I'm going to leave it running at a bit of a 2x speed. I sped it up a little while ago just to kind of get through it, but I'm going to leave this up for a little bit. You can just kind of watch the flight, see how some of the controls handled, see the maneuverability, see me messing with the controls, the updated control scheme, the airport labels, and you'll see some of those micro stutters. So hope you found that beneficial. If you have any questions specifically or anything you'd like me to test, then leave me a comment. But thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.